All right, everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Cutlass Podcast. I hope this finds you well. Hope you've been able to get through and enjoy some of the prior episodes we've had. And throughout the episodes I've done, I've primarily reached back to naval leaders, senior enlisted leaders, occasionally an officer or two here. I've tried to work in some civilian leaders where I can, because frankly, this discussion of leadership and management skill and the experiences and the stories we hear about, they don't just apply to a Navy or a naval audience. They apply to leaders across any spectrum. I think there's something to learn, just like naval leaders can learn from people outside of the Navy and other industries as well. So I've had the privilege to be connected with and interview a few of the former Master Chief Petty Officers in the Navy. And today it's an honor and a privilege to be able to host John Hagan. He was our 8th Master Chief Petty Officer of the Navy, serving from August of 92 to March of 98. And he enlisted back in 1964, right? Not too long ago, I guess, but that was before I was born, John. So I love going back and kind of getting these perspectives. And he eventually went to ETA school, correct? Right? Conventional side. And then we're going to just talk through them and talk through that journey. Again, there's been a lot of things that are covered. There was a book called Winds of Change that was written that highlights a lot of his accomplishments, but it gives some background, but it focuses heavily on his role and his experience as the Master Chief Petty Officer of the Navy. So I'd encourage you to check that book out and the chapter specifically on him if you want to learn more. But I always thought it was cool to be able to get some real-time discussion, bring their experiences into modern context, and really just talk about their leadership experiences growing up in the Navy. So, John, welcome to the Cutlass Podcast, and thanks again for taking some time to join me. How are things going?
Oh, glad to do it, Paul. Good.
Awesome. All right, so let's start early. I know you were born in England, right? So let's talk about just kind of your upbringing and how that leads to a decision to join the Navy. I know that's a long time, but just kind of summary of kind of what was influencing you as a young man.
Okay, I can get to the bottom line on that pretty quickly because being born in England, my father was in the Army Air Force in World War II, refueling bombers, and he met my mother, who was in the Auxiliary Territorial Service, basically the British equivalent of the WACS, and she served longer than my father. She was before we were entered the war, she was serving in uniform in England, and so they met and married, and he eventually brought her and I was born there, to hillbilly part of North Carolina, which was quite a shock for her. I was raised there in Asheville, North Carolina, which is really, at that time, was a beautiful place to be raised from every angle, culture, countryside. And the reason I joined the Navy is as simple as the 89 Trotter Place. I said this in my retirement speech, and my dad sitting on the front row. 89 Trotter Place, my address where I was raised, was not big enough for my father and I. So I was an immature kid. I was a underachiever of some note. I had just was going nowhere fast. And I ended up walking into a recruiter's office on a fairly unhappy day in my life. He told me a lot of lies. He actually told me I could become a nuclear-powered yeoman because I looked through the book and I selected yeoman. And I had taken the test, and he came back and said, well, you qualified to be a nuke. And I said, well, I want to be a yeoman because I can type. And he said, well, you can be a nuclear-powered yeoman. So that's the beginning. When I went to ETA school, I told the class fire at boot camp, he said, you're going to ETA school next. And I said, no, I was going to be a yeoman. He said, no, you're a nuke. And I said, no, I know it. I'm going to be a nuclear-powered yeoman, which point the PN classifier threw me out of the place. So I went to ETA school. At that time, you didn't have to enlist for 6 years to be a nuke. You went to your A school, and at the end of your A school, you were extended for 2 more years and went to nuclear power school, in my case, Vallejo, up at Mare Island for the classroom phase. I didn't do great in A school. I had I think a 71 average, and you had to have a 75 average to go on to nuclear power school. So I was called in after almost a year of training. I was called in, and the counselor said, look, you didn't qualify to go on to Mare Island, but we're going to make a deal with you. If you'll sign all these papers here indicating that you understand you're going to be on night study for the entire time you're there, we'll send you on to Mare Island. Well, I had never given it a lot of thought. I just knew didn't want to go to school anymore. So I declined that and went to regular ET. And it was a good decision. I wasn't mature enough to take that path. I really wasn't. So that was my journey into the Navy. And I won't go into detail about the immature part, but I have a lot of regrets. Things that I did that were childish pranks when I was not a child, but a teenager, that I formally talked about, told these stories around the table with my old friends, laughing about them. And I don't do that anymore because I regret that behavior so much. Dropped out of high school, disappointed my mother greatly. And so that was the background for joining the Navy. In the Navy, I slowly matured. About 2 years into the Navy, I married my longtime girlfriend because if I didn't, she was going to get away from me. There was other suitors. One of them was an ROTC Marine who was getting ready to graduate, and he couldn't get married when he was in ROTC. But that was in his plan. So I had to kind of move fast and ended up getting married as a third class ET. I jokingly tell people that I convinced her to marry me because I told her I now made third class and how affluent I was. And so that was the beginning. That 58 years later, we're getting ready to celebrate our 58th anniversary.
Awesome. Congratulations.
Yeah, in August. So that put me in the Navy and put me on a path to maturing some. But I will say again, looking back, maturing slowly. Over the course of my time on it, I think the Navy gave me some challenges, and responding to the challenges gave me some satisfaction. And I ended up being a pretty good sailor by the time I was a first class. I wouldn't want to brag too much about years before that.
Yeah. I think I went through a similar maturing process. I came in, and it's interesting to hear about the nuclear, power journey there, because it was different when I enlisted, 1987, like you took a nuke field qualifying test before you even, enlisted. So they knew like, oh no, you're going to go. So I knew I was going to be an electrician mate, and I was in the nuke field. So just how that selection process had evolved from the time, hey, you went to rating school and then you had to be selected at that point. I think because not everyone in ETA school would even get considered, right, for nuke power.
Well, no, we took a test prior to enlisting, like you said, and you qualified for the nuclear field. You enlisted as a nuke, but they didn't have the 6-year enlistment at that time. About halfway through my A school, people in the other classes that were just classing up had enlisted for 6 years. I got a 50-week A school on a 4-year enlistment because the Navy's training philosophy in those days was very different. We trained ETs, learned we really got a field engineers kind of education, and without extending. So I only had I had less than 3 years left. When I got out of A school, and a good friend of mine in A school, he had the same situation. He had a 72 or 73 average, and they gave him that option, and he took it. He made it through the Mare Island phase and flunked out in Idaho Falls. And the last time I heard from him, he was on shore duty in Harold E. Holt, Australia. So it was very different. Just one quick aside that is humorous. When I took that test, my recruiter came in and said, and he was just an absolute bullshit artist. He just was he was a second class equipment operator with 4 hash marks. And I was very impressed with all the red on his sleeve and his 2 chevrons. But he came back and said, Hagan, you've made the highest grade that's ever been made in the history of this recruiting district on this test. You're going to be a nuke. So I remembered that. And I went to boot camp. And about halfway through boot camp, I got a letter from my mother where my cousin had gone to see the Navy recruiter. And my mother said, Steve made the highest grade that's ever been made in the history of the recruiting district.
Oh, God.
So it was very clear that everybody that took that test got the feedback that they wanted to hear. Um,
Oh my gosh.
at
Yeah,
any rate,
that
it was
that doesn't give that good name to recruiters, right?
well, I have no ill will toward the guy. I needed to get out of Asheville. He gave me a path,
Yep.
and he did his job. I think probably better than happens today sometimes.
Yeah. And again, like these are, we're young men and women coming in the military. I was 17 when I enlisted, right? Like talk about prefrontal cortex development, nowhere near complete to make good decisions, right? So I just found like the structure of the Navy, I needed it. I knew I had potential. I just didn't know where to apply it. But I found that the structure and the direction they gave at a young age, coupled with what I would say my desire to not disappoint my parents, that was my motivating, self-motivating thing, pushed me to get through nuke power school. And I always say, man, if you threw me back today, I don't know if I would make that same decision. But I also knew I didn't want to go to the fleet as a conventional, right? That was the big thing when we were going through nuke power school. Like, oh, if you fail out, you're going to that thing called the fleet. And that was like, I don't know if I want to go to the fleet. It's kind of the scary thing, but that was funny. So, all right. So early leadership experiences. So we're talking the 1960s. I think a lot was different back then. Just generationally, how those leaders led was different. The country socially was different. So what are you seeing as a young sailor? What's shaping you? What's the tone of the Navy? What's the tone of the chief's mess? What are you liking and what are you not liking so much?
Well, as a young sailor, I barely knew the chief's mess existed. I hardly ever met a chief, hardly ever talked with one. My company commander was a first class bosun mate, possibly the meanest, most devious recruit company commander that ever served. I went to A school. We never had a chief as an instructor. They were either first class or they were civilians. Didn't have a chief that I remember. I think we saw him occasionally, but that was it. The chief was not a role model because he wasn't present. From there, I went to uh, Pax River, Maryland for a short tour. I should add, when I left A school, I wanted to go to a ship on the West Coast. I had a girlfriend in San Leandro, and I wanted to stay on the West Coast. I got orders to Pax River, Maryland, to the Naval Air Technical Training Center. My best friend in A school got orders to a DE out of Long Beach. We went down to the personnel office and asked if we could swap. We were both ETRs, and they ran us out. What I learned later, is that all they had to do is type 2 new sets of orders because they got batch orders, but they weren't willing to do that. So I went to Pax River, Maryland, where I remember a few chiefs. I don't remember any of them because I had any interaction with them, but was noteworthy. Again, I was working for LPOs.
Yeah.
I did have a good LPO for most of that tour, who I stay in touch with to this day. He's retired, lives out on Whidbey Island. He was an eccentric guy. He was very kind to me, and he was he was a role model in terms of, he was always giving me advice on life,
Yeah.
saving money. We had long watches. I was a GCA tech. I was a safety man for GCA tech. So we had these 24-hour stints where we were together. That's the first leader that I can remember in the Navy, period. Besides my company commander, who really could give you nightmares. The first chief that I ever remember meeting was not in my chain of command, but was someone I met at church. He was actually an Airedale, became a lifelong friend and a father figure. He retired as a master chief. Martin Gallion was his name, and he was well known in the aviation community. He was a private pilot. He was a Baptist minister. He was a giving role model for any Christian. And he and his wife kind of adopted my wife and I. I mean, she was there in pigtails. She looked 14 years old when we got married, and I brought her to Pax River, Maryland. So, but I didn't know him in a military setting. I didn't know. He never gave me any Navy advice. It was just, we were just like friends or neighbors out to his house to play. But he was my first true role model and father figure. But again, the point I'm making is there was a pretty good distance between the average sailor and the chief petty officer.
Okay.
And of course, there weren't any senior chiefs. I think senior and master chiefs came along early in my tour,
Okay.
early in my Navy time. But when I went to the USS Leicester, we didn't have a command master chief or command senior chief. There was a senior enlisted who was at that time, he was one of the first E8 machinist mates, but he was very distant. The only time I ever, and he was running the engine. He was running A gang and was a senior engineer. But again, there I had a senior chief OS who was he was a role model. He looked after me, but I didn't have much communication with him. He was busy with the CIC, and it went on like that really throughout my career until I became a chief myself. I made chief at UDT 21. I was a maintenance tech. I took care of the ET shop it was a one-man shop, all the radios and handheld sonars and pathometers for the UDT team. And I had a master chief that I reported to, but the less he saw of me, the more he liked it. And he told me that when I checked in. He said, "You got a shop up there, you keep that thing running, and you and I never even have to meet." It wasn't a mean thing to say. He was trying to make the point that I had autonomy.
Yep.
He was a good man. I had nothing but good chiefs there, but I had no real chain of command relationship with any of them. So that was and then I made chief there. And at my initiation was very different in those days. Was at the CPO club in Little Creek. That club still exists. I've been in it several times lately. Yeah. And my sponsor said, "Come out and pick me up at 4:00 on the day, the 16th of March, 1976. And I did that. I knocked on the door, and he gruffly told me to get back in the car and wait on him. And he came out at 6:30. So the day went on like it was a very, very alcohol-soaked initiation. There was a lot of unsavory things, but nothing really over the top. If I described them if we ever get together and I describe them to you, you would find them comical. They were comical. Yeah. They were creative. The primary objection I had to it was the alcohol. All we were served for the entire day was beer as the selectees. And there was 101 of us. This was the fourth increment. In those days, there was there was no frocking. So there was an initiation every month for 4 to 6 months, depending upon how many increments there were. The second increment, in April, I was a sponsor. So there wasn't a lot of thought given to the sponsor program either. The sponsor was just somebody that got you to the initiation. I don't remember getting any advice. The charge book was a joke. And I remembered that. That stuck in my mind very clearly. So by the time I was MCPON, and I had run initiations on my commands ashore and afloat, but by the time I got to be MCPON, I realized that the initiation was an opportunity to do something that was so rare that it had to be taken. And that drove a large part of my initiatives when I was MCPON. In fact, I came to believe, just to add this, I came to believe that there were only 2 times in the career of a sailor that you had their full attention and you could actually mold their character in a meaningful way. One was boot camp, and the other was CPO initiation, where you had 4 to 6 weeks of their almost undivided attention and a great deal of cooperation. So, and from there, I entered the Chief's Mess, and it was a different place than it is today, but an awful lot of good, hardworking folks. And I think probably more slackers than there are today. I'm just going to be frank about it. The Chief's Mess, almost every Chief's Mess I was in had a number of people who were retired and waiting on their ceremony.
Road program.
The road program was more predominant then than I observed in my later years.
Okay. So a couple points there. So this, I'll tell you. So I saw the chief around. I knew my chief. You know what I mean? We had chief instructors. So honestly, when I walked in the recruiting station, I didn't know at the time it was either a chief or senior chief. I was just drawn to this guy, tall guy, white uniform, summer whites with white shoes, and just that image like struck me like, man, that guy's a cool dude. Right. And then I went to A school and I remember this guy, Senior Chief Wallagora was one of my instructors, submarine guy, just cool, like carried the way he carried himself. I just knew like, I want to be that guy. You know what I mean? I want to be like that. So they were there, but I always found myself more going to the E5, right? So we had some E5 instructors, and then especially on my first ship, my first work center supervisor, Mark McClay, that guy drove our business, right? There was, to your point, I think the chiefs were like, hey, this is yours to run, right? So from the time we broke from quarters and went to the propulsion plant, it was all EM2 McClay driving our day, cleaning stations, maintenance, quals. And then I would see the chief in the office or on watch, Arnie Fisher would come down. But that shaped in me too, this kind of concept of like, no, the E5 should be a frontline powerful leader for us. And sometimes I get concerned, like we displace that level of leadership, or you got to be careful not to. And I think I've made that point before. But the other thing you brought up that I think is important is this concept of informal discussions, right? These discussions on watch, not every leadership mentoring session needs to be in the office, face to face, document, like just walking around, you know what I mean? These backwatch discussions,
Yeah.
right?
In fact, I never had one of those. I have a kind of a different attitude about the word mentoring. I'm not sure I ever had a mentor as it is defined in the dictionary and largely felt to be, but I had a lot of people that influenced me, and they influenced me by their personal standards and their character.
Yeah.
And they were fair with me and everyone else I could see. And I considered, when I look back, that's the closest thing to mentoring, perhaps the very best kind of mentoring, I think. When I went to industry, we had a mentoring program, and I was assigned some junior engineers to mentor, and it baffled me. I thought, how am I going to mentor these people? I barely got time to get my work done, but we did it in industry the same way that I just described. They all worked for me. So, but yeah, that informal on the watch or in the Liberty boat or on Liberty or wherever.
Yeah.
That kind of discussion around your personal circumstances at the time are pretty important. And in my day, there was no leadership training. And I say no. I never went to a leadership school, ever. Not one class. It never happened. There was a leadership class. By the time I had made a senior chief, I got orders to a steam cruiser, the Richmond K. Turner, and I had orders to a 2-week leadership training in route. And that was nixed because the ship called me and said, we're deploying the day. We don't want you to have to fly to the Med and catch the ship. We'll send you that school later. So I said, that's fine with me. And I never went to that school later. I never went to the Senior Enlisted Academy. So I would have benefited from them, I'm sure, but it didn't happen that way.
Yeah.
I did do the military leadership 3 and 2 courses.
Yep.
Which have been done away with. A very bad decision the Navy has made, one that they can't really even explain. Have done away with all those courses and practical factors, or PARs, whatever they called them before they did away with them. So those kind of things influenced me. I took those courses seriously and took the lessons over to the right person, got them scored. But that's the only training besides role model training that I had.
Yeah. And I think the role modeling is absolutely huge on the good and the bad, right? So I think it's important to see what right looks like, but it's also good to see what not right looks like, because that always shaped me. Like, I don't want to be like that. I want to be like that.
Exactly. I had a number of people that influenced me for the good because I said exactly that. I want to be the opposite of that. I want the command that I'm at, or the shop that I'm running, to be better when I leave than when I got there, in a remarkable way that it's impossible not to notice. So anybody that was just on the road program or getting through, I think the bad example can be as influential as a good example.
Absolutely. So let's talk a little more about the kind of the role of the chief and the chief's mess interactions at that point. So just 2 points I want to make. So it's not in writing anywhere. It's a verbal expectation that's grown out of just, I think, chiefs engaging their division officers and their young officers. So what was the attitude at that time towards officer development and ownership of your division officer or department head, and your responsibility to train, quote unquote, or shape their young leadership approaches?
Well, my first EMO was an interesting guy. His name was Giannotti. He was a big burly guy with such a hairy chest that he couldn't keep it all in his shirt, and he really was an unusual guy. And I recall an instance when I was going to influence him by less than conventional means, and he actually physically embraced me, pinned me to the deck, and did this thing like he was counting out, and jumped up and said, "I'm the victor." It was so comical. He was a very fine division officer before it was all over, but he was not your average cat. In fact, what he actually said was, Petty Officer Hagan, I am not your average ensign. I'm a fleet ensign, as in fleet admiral, fleet ensign.
Yeah.
And he was a good influence. I remember him fondly to this day. He lives down in Texas and owns a big game ranch where you can go and shoot African exotic animals and things. So I've stayed in touch with him throughout these years. But that was my very first incident. His relief was a music major who was timid and actually shared with me, facts from his life that made me feel great empathy for him. And I did take him to train because he needed training. Ensign Giannotti not only didn't need training, he was probably the most confident junior officer that I ever met. So I think it's a situational thing. And again, the training, if you're doing your work center right, as an ET, the examples of PMS and the work center, if you do that really well to a high degree of detail and don't let anybody compromise it, and make sure the division officer understands that when he signs that's the training. This thing about training your division officer was always a little mystifying to me. Run your division so that, in fact, his presence is generally not even required, so he can concentrate on his SWO pin, his OOD quals, and those things. That's the way you train the division officer, if you will.
Yep.
And I had after that young ensign, all of my division officers after that were warrants or LDOs, because EMOs were generally prior enlisted. So the young ensigns that I would meet. Now, when I was command master chief, I stood the OOD on the Philippine Sea, and I had every ensign that came in was a JOOD for me until they qualified. So I had an opportunity to influence them, and some have told me that they appreciated the influence I had. So it's situational.
Yeah.
Period.
I never liked the word training them. Like, training is what you do for damage control, right? It's a preconditioned response, right? On this situation, I want you to respond in this specific way using these steps, right? I thought it was more like education, right? I'm educating this young person on how the Navy works, how life works, the gray areas, how to navigate that, educating them on how the division runs, right? I'm running it as the chief. But hey, here's how you get along in this organization, kind of that kind of stuff. Now, what about peer-to-peer relationships in the chief's mess? So like you said, right, in the context, like today modern chiefs are like, oh, they probably think we've had senior chiefs and master chiefs forever, but we didn't. Was that established at that point to where, hey, we got senior chiefs and master chiefs, or like it's just known in the mess that kind of works? Are they running herd? Are they providing leadership to the chief's mess? Or do you still have that kind of what I would envision, that kind of tenured chief that's been in a while, knows it, and kind of drives the chief's mess? Or was it like, hey, the command master chief's just calling the shots?
Well, again, when I checked into the first chief's mess afloat, I was a brand new senior chief, and it was a very hard time for the Navy. Yeah, I don't think it's really not possible for anybody that wasn't there to fully appreciate the challenges we had at that time. The drug problem was immense. There were no weapons for the drug problem. Urinalysis didn't exist, and then when urinalysis did come into play, it was not admissible at NJP until 1982 in January. And that date is significant. I'll tell you why. But that Chiefs mess, that ship was dysfunctional in many ways because the drug use was so predominant. There was quite a bit of, I would say, insubordination, but that's too strong a word. But there was a lax military attitude. And yet, that ship steamed very well. It was a steam cruiser that, took a lot of work on the part of the BTs. There were enough good chiefs, hard-working chiefs, to hold it together.
Okay.
But the Chiefs mess itself was not a place where anybody got any. When I checked in, we had our command senior chief was an electrician mate, 3M coordinator. He didn't have a billet then. And about 1/3 of the way through the deployment, he walked up to me and he kept the command senior chief badge on a little leather thing that was on his button of his khaki shirt.
Yeah.
He unbuttoned it, got my hand and put it in my hand like this and said, "I'm going on emergency leave. You're the command senior chief until I get back." I said, "What?" He said, "The captain wants me to be." He said, "Doesn't matter what the captain wants." I was the newest senior chief on board. I don't know why he gave it to me, but I did it. He never came back. He never came back from that
Wow.
Emergency leave. So I did my best to make some changes in that Chiefs mess that was lackadaisical. Just for one example, that Chiefs mess had so many foul weather jackets hanging on the bulkhead around the mess that you couldn't have hung another one up there. They were mostly greasy and dirty. There were more foul weather jackets than there were chiefs in the mess. The Chiefs mess was not impressive to walk into. So I asked everybody to claim their jacket and take it down to their compartment. We had 2 CPO compartments. And the ones that were not claimed, I took them to the lucky bag. Got the mess cleaned up. I didn't do a lot of things because I wasn't a strong enough leader at the time. We had chiefs that stayed in the mess the entire day. 2 chiefs that I remember, good people. I remember them. They were friends, but they didn't do their job. Once they sat in a chair in the mess the entire day. One didn't even go to quarters. That seems astounding, but that's the way it was. That the CO was a good CO. He made Admiral Jerry Janekow. His relief. Now, a couple of years later, fast forward, because I think this is interesting to people that don't know it. The drug problem was bad. You could take somebody to mast, and unless you caught them in the act with the substance, they couldn't be convicted. Now, because NJP has some latitude, maybe they could be convicted, but if they appealed it, they could get away with it. Well, in January of 1982, urinalysis became admissible at NJP. The change in the Navy's ability to combat that destructive force was immense. And it was illustrated on my ship. We had a command-wide sweep after a Christmas stand down. And now everybody peed in the bottle. When it came back, we had 44 positives. Now, bear in mind that the threshold for a positive was much different than today, very high. You basically had to have a lot in your system. 44 positives out of a crew of about 425. They were mostly junior people, a couple of first class. We had 11 masts a week for a month. The captain declined to do any. And I went to every one of them. By this time, I was the equal opportunity person. Yep. I went to every mast. 40 of them got the maximum, busted, fined, restricted. 4 of them were so convincing in their plea to the captain that he gave them a polygraph. Polygraph was quite a long time in coming before NCIS got around to doing it. And they did it on a Saturday when I remember I had the duty, and they all took their polygraph test. When the results came back, 3 were untruthful, and 1 was there were 3 categories, but 1 was not deemed. It was deemed inconclusive, and that 1 actually worked for me. It was an ET1. So years later, when I ran into this guy, he told me that he had used it, but he did everything he could to try to keep his Navy career tracking.
Yeah.
After that, urinalysis began to, we didn't have zero tolerance, so it didn't result in a discharge, but it began to have an impact. Later on, urinalysis combined with zero tolerance had an even greater impact. So that Chiefs mess, many problems, but I watched the Chiefs mess get better as some of the folks in there retired and got out, and we got junior people in. We had our second CO was a guy that you might have met, Admiral David Robinson, who was Surf Pack, the best CO I ever had, the most holder of a Navy Cross, should have been a Congressional Medal of Honor. Anybody that ever read his citation and the people that were there thought it should have been a Congressional Medal of Honor. But he wore that very lightly. So we had great leadership at the command level, and the Chiefs mess, I thought, got better and better as some of the social problems receded.
Yep.
But in terms of what you asked me about, I didn't really answer it. There wasn't a cohesive Chiefs mess. There was it was where we lived and ate. There weren't meetings like we do today. The command senior chief was really a fairly new role. The badge was pretty new.
Yeah.
And so it was not really, you weren't really sure what the obligations were.
Yeah. Who was the MCPON at this point?
Well, that's an interesting question, because the MCPON at that point was Tom Crow. And the only reason I know that is because on that ship, back in port after a couple of deployments, now we have the first billeted command master chief. He came in, an OSCM, really a salty guy. He came to the mess and said, we're all going over to the club today because the Master Chief of the Navy is going to be there and he's going to talk. I had never heard, I was unfamiliar with the billet of the Master Chief of the Navy. I'd never heard of Del Black.
Yep.
There wasn't a profile like there is today. There wasn't a social media. If you missed the all hands article about it, if you didn't happen to see that, you didn't even know the billet existed.
Yeah.
I truly did not know the billet existed. I was a senior chief on a cruiser out of Charleston. We went to the club, but by this time I'm beginning to be interested in how I can be a better influence and do better things. And so I went to the club. The beer, I remember the beer coming back and forth. Everybody was drinking. That was a lot of people didn't go back to the ship after a liquid lunch.
Liquid lunches. Yep, that's what they called them.
And Tom Crow gave a talk. This was in the time that Admiral Watkins was the CNO, and we were recovering from some really bad times in the past. And he had instituted a program called Pride and Professionalism. You probably heard about it.
Yep.
And the entire objective of that program was to raise our standards, make us more aware of our heritage and our obligations and so forth. So, I mean, it's pretty obvious. So Tom Crow, who was a tremendous leader and Master Chief, my first exposure to him or any other MCPON, he gave a little talk. And he said, I'd like to take some questions. And every question was a help me get orders, help me do this, do something for me.
Right.
I was beginning to be embarrassed by the kind of questions that were coming out of the Chiefs mess. And at some point, Tom Crow had had enough and said, all right, we're done here. I'll be happy to stay here and take more questions and talk to you, but I only want to hear a question about somebody that works for you that needs something or some way we can make the Navy better. No more questions about you and your career and your needs. Mostly it was about orders. Everybody wanted to stay in Charleston when they got orders, and the mean old detailer was not cooperating. I was very impressed with that. And he was so, he was a big guy. And the change in his attitude, which was from polite, very careful communication, like a switch was turned, it was stern, and here's the story. That impressed me so much. And there was not another question. I went back to the ship, very impressed. I didn't meet him or shake his hand that day, but that made a big impression on me. again, I didn't think much about the Master Chief of the Navy billet until, again, for quite a while.
Yeah.
But Tom Crow became a good friend. Every time I went to San Diego, I went out to his house for steak dinner, spent hours with him, and grieved his death to this day. But that's probably hard for a young chief to understand now. We didn't know that the MCPON billet existed. Now I meet people that tell me, quite often I meet people who say, I learned your name in boot camp.
Yeah.
It's just got a very different profile, a great deal more support. And a lot of that happened on my watch.
Yep.
I think I had the best support from the CNOs in terms of Admiral Kelso, Admiral Borden, Admiral Johnson. And I think Dwayne had good support from his two CNOs. Prior to that, the CNO MCPON relationship was not that close, not that meaningful. I know you've read that in Dale Black's day, his CNO said, "Go away, I don't want to talk to you."
Yep.
Billy Sanders shared with me that he had zero connection with his CNO. In fact, Billy Sanders came, this is fast forward till I'm the Force Master Chief at Centetra. Billy Sanders came to a command visit to Millington, where I was the Force Master Chief for the Chief of Naval Technical Training. And I shared with him that I was pretty unhappy with my connection to my admiral. He didn't listen to me. He didn't want to talk to me. I had made some inroads with him, but he was a very careful nuke who never made a decision until it had to be made.
Right.
And Billy Sanders shared with me, he said, "John, I know what you're talking about because I live with that with my CNO. And you just have to get through it." And he called me a few days later and he said, "I want to tell you something. I was thinking about terminating and going back to sea because I was pretty unhappy with the situation I was in." Billy Sanders called me and said, "John, I got some news for you. I can't give you all the details, but in a very short while, your situation that you described with me with your admiral is going to change dramatically." Well, he knew that Admiral David Harlow had gotten orders to be the Chief of Naval Technical Training, and it was night day.
Yeah.
The day the guy checked in, if I brought him a message that I had written, he signed it. He didn't edit it. He didn't send it back to an ACOS to look at this. My previous admiral would call NR. He was a nuke. He would call NR for permission to do things in the Navy technical training world. He was a good guy. I mean, he was quite a intellectual person and accomplished guy. But Admiral David Harlow was a different. I never had any change like that. And Billy Sanders cued me in on that. So,
what was Admiral Harlow's warfare area?
He was a pilot. He was a E2 pilot and an S2 pilot, and he had been the deputy C&P when he came down. He came down there as a retirement job, and 2 years with him was. I wrote the Integrated Training Brigade instruction that established company commanders at A school and marching back and forth to class and doing PT and having GMT. Was a very tough time. I couldn't get the money for the billets, but we wrote the SORM for that, which was an extensive document, and he signed it basically without reading it.
Yeah.
Flipped through the chapters. That's the kind of support that is very rare.
Yeah. That's advice. That's great advice to those thinking about being a command senior enlisted leader or actively in the billet, because you are going to come across leaders. They're all different. They have their own personalities. The advice I got early on was like, hey, remember when you get in those situations, it's your job to try to get along first, you know what I mean? And kind of manage it. Unfortunately, I can say as all my command master chief tours, I had good leaders, and it matters, right? So you can get, that, right? You can get a lot done as command master chief. You can get a hell of a lot more done when you've got a CO and an XO, frankly, that have your back and then reinforce and empower and extend some of their authority to your position. So I'm with you on that. And I asked what their background was. I did see, to the point about nukes, and you can see personality differences with the different communities, just how the culture shapes their leadership. I could not, even within the aviation community, if I had, a front seat pilot in a Rio, I could see the difference in the leadership style there and how they made decisions, right? So the front seaters, if they were fighter pilots, would tend to make quick decisions. And my advice would be like, all right, let's kind of think through that a little more. We're not flying a jet and in combat right now. And the Rios would be very thought provoking. So that would be like, okay, we're overthinking. Let's get to a decision. And then your submarines were nukes, right? So they had a risk aversion, or they would think through. And I appreciated that being a nuke, but at the same time, just being able to nudge and go, okay, you're okay, right? Just let them know. Did you see that kind of similar experience?
Well, I had the best examples until I was MCPON. I didn't really have. They were all SWOs really, but as MCPON, I had a nuke submariner, Admiral Kelso. Had a great relationship with him. He was very good to me. In addition to being supportive, he was kind.
Yeah.
And decent. A wonderful, wonderful gentleman. And I had Admiral Borda, a seat of the pants SWO, who came from the enlisted ranks.
Yeah.
2 years for Kelso, almost 2 years with an F-14 pilot, Admiral J. Johnson. So the difference in their styles was marked, but the thing that I did get from each one of them was total support.
Yeah.
Now it was different support. With Admiral Kelso, I had to be more. I wrote the first instruction. One of the things that I am proud that I did, that I kind of took it up in the back of my mind that I was going to do it the first opportunity, is I wrote the instruction that bans smoking inside the skin of surface ships and inside the submarine, except for one designated space. I wrote that instruction personally, every line of it. I walked it through every person. I had to deal with some naysayers, and I had to deal with some side activities that were actually well intended, but were causing me problems and getting it assigned. In the beginning, when I told Admiral Kelso I was going to start on this, he said, good, it's long overdue. But with Kelso, it was not a matter of taking him the instruction to sign after I'd walked it through C&P and the like. With Admiral Borda, that same issue, I could have taken it to him and he would have signed it. Kelso was more careful. He wanted everybody else to be on board with it, but he was totally supportive. And so on a number of occasions, I had to say, look, I know I remember one person who was in 6 or PERS 6 at the time, and he was opposing this for no real reason. And the only thing he told me, I said, what's your opposition? He said, well, you're taking something away from sailors. I said, no, you're giving something to sailors. You're giving them clean air in the space where they live and in a movie place where they sit and watch the movies. And you just don't understand. He said, well, I do understand because my wife's a smoker and I wouldn't want to take that away from her. How do you argue with that? I just said, okay. But I had to walk it through all those people, take it to Admiral Kelso, and then he might have called a couple of them and talked to the VCNO. With Admiral Borda, with something as clearly positive as that, he would have signed it.
Yeah.
And I had that kind of experience. Admiral Johnson, he was as supportive as Kelso and Borda, but more distant. He never ever told me no on anything I wanted to do or any initiative I had. But he didn't get on board them with the same. Admiral Borda on occasion would tell me, more than one time he told me, when you're traveling around a fleet and you want something done because you see something that's wrong and you want it rectified, you tell them that I'm on board with it. If I don't know about it when it's brought to me, the people that bring it to me will never know that I didn't know about it. That's powerful.
That is.
And Borda was the only one that gave me that kind of license, just an unbelievable connection. But yeah, they were very different. And you talked about having different kinds of bosses, and I run into people that talk about how in some cases they are very difficult. But in every case, I always thought my job was to make them successful. And I'm not sure that I thought it through as cleanly as that. But whatever the particular mission we were preparing for, the objective of the day, it was about the CO looking good. In my division, the ET shop or the operations department, not being something that stood out in a negative way on the CO. I had nothing but good COs. I don't have a memory of any bad commanding officer. I did have a couple of XOs that were screened out because they just didn't have the leadership. They weren't right for command, and they actually were
Yeah.
strained out. So I was, when I look back, division officers, COs, XOs, even those guys that I just mentioned, I had no problem working for them. I never felt anything except support of varying degrees.
Yeah. Awesome. No, that's good. I think that's great insight. And
But remember, I
I think
came
good
from a
insight
time, but I point out, I came from a time when it was drilled into us that they're senior to you, so they're right.
Yep.
And you do what they're told without, you do what they tell you without any argument. And that gradually gave way to a little more cerebral look at it, or take on it. And that was, for the most part,
Yeah.
good.
Yeah. And I talk about that too, this impact of generational leadership. Like each generation has their style. So that cheese mess and that wardroom, frankly, that senior wardroom you grew up under, you're talking, the greatest generation kind of leadership, post World War II leaders. And that generation really, one of their primary attributes was respect for authority and position, right? So it was like, you don't question authority, you just follow orders. And obviously now you can see that has changed to a different perspective. Not that you don't follow, challenge authority, or that you don't follow your authority, but my generation, Gen X, watching failures of leadership publicly and all, right, it just shapes, and how that impacts leadership approaches of organizations is something I find fascinating. I've done some episodes on that. So talking about philosophies, so I appreciate, one thing you sent me was your charge letter. So you're, as you're growing and developing, I think we continually develop our leadership philosophies, continue to develop and mature. So you had, yours was success is a journey, not a destination, journey on. So I wanted to take a minute to talk about how you kind of came to that. And then also in the write-up, in your personal note, this kind of concept of balancing the priority of the mission against this concept of taking care of people, and how people can get those twisted and get in a bad place. So if you could talk through that a little bit, I think that'd be really great insight for our audience.
It pleases me that you got that out of my charge, because that's exactly what I intended. Success is a journey, not a destination, is kind of an old proverb that made a lot of sense to me. And why it hit me when I started using it as a young chief, writing in the charge books, and it kind of hit me that a lot of people, when they made chief, I don't know a lot of people, but enough people to be noticeable, when they made chief, took their pack off. They were there. They would even tell you, hey, I'm already 2 pay grades higher than I ever expected to be. And they never did much after that in the way of good work for the Navy. My point was, journey on, look at what's the next achievement, and at a more important dimension, look at what you can do for the people that work for you and the people that you influence. And you influence a lot more people than just those that work for you. You influence them by your example. And I've got an example I like to use there that I'll do this real quickly. There's the example that I have. There was a bosun mate chief in the mess that was so quiet. He was a black bosun mate chief that was up early every morning for clamp down of sweepers. He ran First Division very, very well. And First Division wasn't a collection of great hard chargers. They were kind of your typical First Division in that day, with your share of Cat 4s, number of people that had been to mast.
Mm-hmm.
But he ran First Division so well. He was protective of his people. He hardly ever said a word in the mess. In fact, I never heard him talk in the mess. He came in on his spare time, if he had any. He was working a course to be a locksmith. And his name was Alonzo McMorris. I probably only had 2-3 conversations with him in a whole med cruise. One of those conversations was when one of my ETs was caught throwing coffee grounds over the side of the ship. And he came to see me, but he was so good at his job. He was at the rig every unrep, but he hardly ever said a word to anybody. Now, we had in that same mess the people that I just described who stayed in the mess all day.
Mm-hmm.
They were the other kind of role model. I've been trying to locate, and I think I have located him, but he's not responding to the phone numbers that I got. So I'm hoping to get to Charleston and knock on his door one day and tell him what an influence he was on me. It would probably astound him, as it has astounded me when young sailors that served with me have told me that I was a positive role model, a mentor for them. The point I'm making is that the young chiefs, if they could just understand, they're going to influence people that they will never, ever know about simply by their conduct, their high standards, doing their job well, doing it well when nobody's looking and when it doesn't matter. That's the influence that Alonzo McMorris had on me. No other chief in that mess had that kind of influence on me. Very few chiefs in my entire career had that kind of influence. But on that charge, the other point that I'm trying to make is one of the things I don't like to hear from command master chiefs, and it'll sound like I'm some sort of a callous person, but I hope people don't take it that way. But I really hate to hear over and over again about taking care of sailors. I've heard it from people, and as you talk to them, they view taking care of sailors as taking their chit and getting them approved, getting them into whatever program they want to be in, getting them what they want when they want it. And I don't view that as taking care of sailors. Yes, there are times when you have to go to bat for somebody, and I have some instances in the past when I had to go to bat for someone who had been restricted unfairly. I took it to the XO, who would not change his mind until I actually showed him in Navy regs where he didn't have the authority to do what he was trying to do. And I worried that was going to cost me on my next eval, and it didn't. I've had a few of those instances, but generally speaking, you can run that way too far.
Yeah.
The mission, getting the PMS done. Again, I'm an ET, so I go back to having all the equipment working all the time, having all your ETs, surface warfare qualified to a high standard. That's important. And I try to make that point and they won't necessarily like you for it. The example I give you at my 20-year reunion from the Command Master Chief tour on the Philippine Sea, I had a number of folks come up to me and say, in exact words in one case, Master Chief, when we were serving together, I hated you. I thought, well, I don't know where this is going. But then they went on to say, it took me my next command to figure out that you were looking out for me. I owe you a lot. And it was a very sincere. They didn't have to say it. They said it privately. I got an email from somebody or a Facebook message from somebody I just connected with as a now retired bosun mate chief. And he said, the same words. When we were serving together, I hated you because of that time that you got me for wearing my hat. I don't have any memory of this, of course, but wearing my hat wrong. And you made me go and read uniform regs. And I hated you for that. You embarrassed me, was humiliating or whatever. He said, but over the years, I got that into perspective and you influenced me. And it was a very nice note. So that's the point I'm trying to make is you influence people by your standards and imposing those standards in a fair way with common sense.
Yeah. There's a clip out there of Denzel Washington, and this resonates with me, where he's talking about, comfort, anyone who's comfortable, never achieves great things, right? Adversity is what causes growth, right? And I'm not talking like being an asshole to someone, and being callous and malicious, but I think imposing adversity and challenge, right? Like written in the CPO creed, not just to new chiefs, but to young sailors. Nuclear power school was just like your A school, right? That was adversity and challenge, but I grew stronger, right? It forced me to mature, forced me to learn. I didn't necessarily like it, but then you get through it on the other side and you come out better and stronger. And I think some leaders, I don't know if they're wanting to be liked. Maybe they just don't like to impose adversity for some reason, or they think that's a bad thing. I would caution them that I think you can be doing some harm or at least restricting the growth of your people, and learning to impose that adversity, the right level of it, right? You got to account, again, situational leadership. But I think that's great part of the success as a journey, and not taking the backpack off and continuing. Yes, even that new chief, right? You still have things to learn, right? You still have growth to do. Just because what got you successful and into the chief's mess, that won't necessarily make you good senior chief. That won't make you good mass chief. That won't make you good command mass chief. And senior chiefs imposing adversity on their young chiefs, I think, is important as well. That's why I asked about that relationship in the chief's mess.
Yeah, when you use the word imposing adversity, and I would also use the term. People don't like it when you impose structure. And I had one short tour in the Naval Reserve Center, where as soon as I became the command senior chief, when the command chief had checked out, and I made senior chief right after that. And this particular reserve center was used to mustering in the lounge while the chief went up to talk to the CO and then came back with the word for the day. And I chafed at that, but I was not the senior enlisted. So as soon as the day that I said, we're not mustering back here anymore. We're following for quarters in the gym. And when I go to see the captain, Petty Officer Grundy will take charge, and you'll stand easy in ranks. They were so opposed to that. Oh, we don't do that. It's not necessary. I had 5 or 6 TARs and 5 or 6 active duty and some TIMACs. And the active duty that had just gotten so really lazy. But it was 3 or 4 weeks or a few months, and they had forgotten that we used to muster the other way. But when I first imposed the structure on them, and that and some other structures of actually coming to work on time and not leaving at the Liberty Call, there was a great deal of backbiting and bitching and moaning.
Yeah.
People don't like to have structure imposed on them when they are in a more relaxed, easy lane. And that's not adversity. We're 2 or 3 steps away from adversity there.
Yep. No, I even find even now, my current job, it's a remote position, right? So there's a lot of autonomy and privilege, not unlike being a command mass chief, right? So I always knew, like, hey, I have that privileged autonomy. I travel, my boss doesn't really give me direction. So it's on me to inform, right? So I even had structure in place of, like, hey, communication structure with my boss, especially at the flag level. Like, yeah, you're giving me, I don't have to come in and check in, but I want you to know what I'm doing. Because perhaps you can come back and reinforce it, or maybe there's something I'm doing. I'm taking off on a path, so I want that watch team backup. But just to have that structure to keep me on path. I even do it now, right? I have communication discipline with my current boss, who lives in DC, and if I didn't have the structure and put structure in my day as a remote employee, it could get I could easily see a path where you stop losing efficiency in your work for sure, so I'm a fan of that structure. I do want to touch on writing, right? So you and I have a connection there. You were one of the co-authors of the first Chief Petty Officer's Guide. You've written in Proceedings magazine. So when did writing as a vehicle of influence, kind of take off for you? Or where did you really see, like, oh, this could be powerful for me? And how did the path to the CPO guide happen?
Well, the path to the CPO guide is kind of not really related to the writing so much as just the status that I had as MCPON and Tom, our contact there at the Naval Institute, who I greatly admired and got to know him a little bit. But writing, I told you that I was a high school dropout. When I got to Whidbey Island for my first shore tour, a full shore tour, I started going to classes at night, and I earned an associate's degree. And I actually, I don't know where I had the energy and the time to do that, but I got a full 2 years of college with the first 2.5 years that I was there at night classes. And when the night classes ran out, I got permission from my boss. By that time, I was running a radar site, the search radar site that overlooks Whidbey Island, and I was running it pretty efficiently. We were overmanned, so I had a pretty big team. So I asked my division officer if I could work the night shift hold quarters in the morning and go to class in the daytime and then come back at the end of the day. And he let me do that for 2 quarters. So I went to school full time for 2 quarters, and I graduated, was able to fly my mother out. My mother flew out to Skagit, out to Whidbey Island, and attended my graduation. So that's one of my best memories because it made up for, in some way, dropping out of high school.
Yeah.
So that's just the background there that I like to brag about, actually, I guess. But during that time, I did a lot of writing. I took all the creative writing courses, and I enjoyed them. And history. Actually, I enjoyed all my courses, I think, except music appreciation was the only course that I made a C in, strangely enough. But
Yeah.
I enjoyed all the courses, but I liked writing. I liked history because you wrote a lot of essay um, answers to questions and essays. And so I guess there I learned that I wasn't afraid of it. I don't know if I was particularly good at it, but I wrote some short stories and things like that. Then you get up in to the responsibilities, and you start writing evals, and you start writing instructions. And as MCPON, if it was an instruction that I wanted to influence, if it was a new, like the Command Master Chief instruction I mentioned, or the
Yeah.
smoking, I wrote those instructions from scratch. And you get to where, we'll go back further. I wrote all the evals on the last ship I was on. Not evals, but awards. It got to where the officers, the department heads brought me the names. It got to be second nature because they're so, the format is so
Yeah. Yep.
standard. And I learned an interesting thing when I was writing awards. If I was stuck on getting the citation right, I'd sit back and think about it. And more often than not, I would say, you know why I'm stuck? Because this person doesn't deserve this award. I can't write something that's that big a
Yeah.
stretch.
Yep.
And I would downgrade it and send it back and say, we need to make this an LOC. Or in some cases, let's just not recognize this, because
Yeah.
some department heads would want to have the same percentage of their people recognized for an end of tour award or end of deployment award as the other department. And it
Yeah.
really didn't work that way. But I wrote literally every award that went down on that ship for almost the entire time I was a command master chief, with very few exceptions. So by the time I got asked to participate in the Naval Institute project there, the CPO handbook, I was pretty enthusiastic about it, but I was in a very bad spot at work. And I actually tried to back out of it, and Tom said, I don't want you to do that. What you've written is enough. I'd written the part about CPO, some background on CPO initiation,
Yeah.
and some other things that came easy to write. But the case studies, which my co-author was writing, I thought were really bad. And I wanted to rewrite all of those, but I did not have the time.
Right.
I
Yep.
was in a position at work where I was traveling heavily, and I called Tom and said, I'm gonna have to back out on this. And he persuaded me to just leave what I had written there. And I didn't like doing it because, and I'm sorry for how negative this sounds, but I just didn't like the case studies that my co-author, who was a second class radioman, and we didn't get along. I didn't have a good rapport with him. And partially it was my fault because I was, again, not pulling my share of the load.
Yeah.
But what I wrote on the CPO initiation, I was glad to get that written because some of that was original research that I had done. A good bit of it I did. I got to sit for 3 days with a great crowd of World War II chiefs. I don't know if you ever heard of the National CPO Association, kind of a defunct now, but it was never really strong. But they had an annual meeting. This year it was in Orlando, and they were in competition with another organization called the International CPOs, because they were broken away because the National CPO Association refused to allow chiefs from other navies.
Right.
And so they had this, and they were old codgers and curmudgeons, really, but they were great sailors of the past. And I had 3 days with them where I just interviewed over and over again about what was your experience making chief in World War II, or shortly after World War II, or whenever they made it. And that's when I discovered what I thought was the origin of the charge book, the evolution of the initiation. And so I got some of that down in drafts for that publication. And I wrote the foreword for it, and I wrote the foreword for the next one. I think I wrote the foreword for
Yeah, for the second edition, that's the one I wrote. So that's when I reached out to have you write that.
And to be honest, the foreword for that book, I was very pleased with the words that came to me because that was for the Blue Jackets manual. Actually, I'm thinking about
Okay.
the foreword for the Blue Jackets manual. But I don't think I'm a great writer. I just think that if I work hard on it, I do a lot of edits. I put out something in my MCPON tour that I wish that I had every copy, but I wasn't smart enough when I retired to collect them all. I put out a direct line. It was a written direct line. There was no internet. I had a good journalist. I had two good journalists, and the second one was a real good desktop publisher guy. And we got that down to something. We mailed it. I mailed it to every UIC in the Navy. That's a lot.
Yeah. Yep.
To the senior enlisted leader, and it was pretty effective. But I would write an article for it that I wanted. I'm thinking in one case, I wrote an article about the process that the admin board process at that time was really hurting us. People who had committed real crimes were being retained in the Navy because of the way the admin board was conducted. And you might not identify with this or certainly remember it, but at that time, if you had a bad actor, you got them off of the ship over to the group or the naval station where their admin board was conducted. And it was very often there was nobody there to speak for, or if you will, against the person who was getting the discharge, and they'd be retained in the Navy.
Yeah.
In one case that I uncovered, it was a person who had sexually assaulted a sailor on the forestall in the barracks that they were living in up in Philadelphia while the forestall was in the yards. And that he was a machinist mate chief, and he was retained by the admin board that the ship never even sent a representative to. I had two other examples of that. That was the primary example. And so the article that I wrote, I needed it to convey how important this was. And I had three examples and made the point that you have got to have a person familiar with the case from the command at the admin board. Well, that article went all over the Navy. And my JO started recording the calls we got. And we got calls from virtually every NLSO in the Navy. I mean, literally, day after day, he got calls and he recorded them. He said about half of the legal officers in the Navy think that you're wrong and that you don't understand due process. And the other half said 3 cheers. The Navy JAG, which was a guy named Admiral Grant, came to my office and asked me to retract the article. And wow. I said, I'm not going to retract it.
Yep.
And I said, but I'll do it if you talk to Admiral Kelso. And he tells me to retract it. I'll do it. I worked for Admiral Kelso. And Admiral Grant was a great guy. So it wasn't a confrontational thing. In fact, he was in my office for hours that day. Admiral Grant said, I've already talked to Admiral Kelso. I said, well, what did he say? He said, go talk to the Master Chief. But my point was, I put a lot of effort into the writing. It didn't come naturally sometimes. My journalist, who at the time was a guy named Neil Gilbo and then Cleve Hardman. Later on, Chief Hardman came to me when we were trying to get the direct line out. And I had been editing and sending it back to him, and he was revising it. And he came in, and he was all huffy and moving jerkily and gave me the direct line. And I said, Cleve, what's the problem? He said, well, the problem is your urge to edit is stronger than your sex drive. He said, this is 8 times you've sent this back, and you're changing things back to the way they were on the second edit. Well, he was a great guy. He was always very respectful. And I sat and thought about that for a minute. And I walked out and said, you're right, Cleve. I'll take that under advisement. So he brought it in. I signed it out. That was my birthday. It was May the 20th. And we were having a barbecue at my house for my birthday with a birthday cake. And as I'm leaving the office, I'm next to the last one to leave. Cleve is still there. And I said, Cleve, are you coming out for the barbecue? How can I? I'm covered up with work. So later on, he showed up as the last one to show up for the barbecue. But I never forgot that because he was right. I always wanted to make it better. So that was a weakness of my writing. And I sometimes never finished something. But I don't claim any great creativity or writing skills. I just was willing to write it and edit it. And
yeah. That's most of it is just doing it, right? And then usually people are there who can help you, clean it up, or some have a better, proclivity towards writing or natural talent with it. But um, there are a lot of people that will help
I wrote
you.
all of my testimony for Congress, all of it, every word of it. I'll give you an example of on the other end of the spectrum, my Air Force counterpart. We were sitting waiting to testify, waiting for the congressman to come into the testimony room. And he shared with me that he didn't even know what was in his testimony. He didn't get a chance to read it. Air Force OLA wrote his testimony for him.
Yeah. Yep.
And he was laid back. He was in the last year of his tour, Gary Finkston. I wrote every word of my testimony, and my OLA, my first OLA was Captain Pete Roberts. He just stayed away from me.
Yeah.
My second OLA was Captain John Harvey, now retired.
Oh,
4-star.
who would be, yeah.
Yeah.
Admiral Harvey.
Nuke.
Yep.
We had a great relationship. He didn't like the fact that I wrote all my testimony, but he knew he couldn't do anything about it. So he came and spent time in my office. On one occasion, we were working on my testimony very late because it was due the next morning. And my wife brought us supper in the office at about 20:30 or so. And we developed what I think was a great bond, Harvey and I. But it was my testimony. And that's what I told them when they wanted to edit it. On one occasion, OMB, which for some strange reason, the testimony went through OMB. OMB edited it so heavily, redlined it so heavily, and sent it back to my office for me to make these changes that I declined to make any changes. They declined to forward it. So I went over to testimony with no testimony submitted, but I had, of course, my copies of it. And it worked out better than any other testimony session I ever went to because when they asked, where was my testimony? I said, I've got a copy of it right here, but it's a copy of what I wrote. The copy that OMB would not forward was so heavily edited that I declined to change it. So I had copies for everybody that was there. It actually worked out better because I got to make the point that I was being censored.
Yeah.
But I wrote all the testimony. Again, it didn't come easy, and I wasn't the kind of writer that could do write something on the first draft and be happy with it. But interesting, you should mention it because right now you mentioned the Winds of Change. I'm not in the Winds of Change because it was written for MCPON 1 through 7. A second edition has been toyed with, and we all submitted. A journalist was assigned. Bushy got it organized this and got a journalist assigned to come and interview all of us, and nobody was happy with his work. So the project was stillborn. My input was write your own. I mean, I'm happy with what the edit that I've been able to do to what this journalist wrote.
Yeah.
But why don't you write your own? And I think the reason is because everybody's not as comfortable writing as everybody else.
Yeah.
Or maybe don't have the time, don't want to take the time. They'd rather tell the story and have somebody that's a professional, quote, do it. But
yeah, it is. I mean, there's an investment there, especially when you're editing and, kind of thing. So I get that, having written articles and these guides for the Naval Institute.
You always find something that you wish the word.
Yeah.
Every time
I eventually have to just send it and just go, okay, this is it, right? Because you'll just keep, like the third edition of the CPO guide I just submitted. I was like, it's definitely an elevation, right? It's an adjustment, and I was glad to be able to elevate that. Now with the Petty Officer's Guide in place now, I'm like, all right, there's all the fundamental leadership. Now let's take this and put content that prepares you to be welcome to the mess all the way up to your journey to potentially being the MCPON or serving on a 4-star COCOM. Build it. But I'd have it almost ready, and then I'd hear something. I'm like, oh, that's a great point. I got to build that into this section, right? And if I kept doing that, I'd never get it submitted. So I had to slap the table and submit it. So, all right, John, I think we're going to wrap now. I just want to throw it back to any final thoughts or advice that you want to throw out there to the audience on leadership and journeying on.
I think I'll kind of do what the PAO, when you get your PAO training, when you become the MCPON, they send you to a couple of days of PAO training. And a lot of it is pretty much boilerplate. But the one thing that I remembered, and I worked it to my advantage, was when you're being interviewed by journalists and even by Congress, don't answer the question they ask you. Answer the question you wanted them to ask you.
Yeah.
That was really good advice because it helped me on a number of occasions to get my point across and get it on the record. So I'll answer that question a little bit differently because you threw this out early about the MCPON process. I meet people from time to time who say my goal is to be the MCPON. Well, I think that's a really bad goal. There's one billet. It's filled not by a competency test or any other objective standard. And in my day, it was filled. I think the process that was used in my day and for Bushy and for me and for a couple of others after me is superior to what they do today. I'm very critical of the current process and the Fleet and Force Master Chief insular entity that we have today, where you have to be in one of those billets in order to compete. To me, that says all of those guys out there on carriers and cruisers and LPHs are not qualified, and the CNO should not be able to choose from them. I think that's insanity. I back off that and say I think that's wrong. I don't want to be too critical because they evolved to be like the Army, I think, perhaps for some other services. To me, it's the CNO's prerogative, and you reduce his prerogative to this small number of people. I don't understand that at all. Admiral Kelso got to select from everybody in the Navy that was a master chief, a command master chief, who wanted the job, narrowed down to a few people to be interviewed in a pretty structured process. They used a component of the E9 board, stayed in session and screened the packages. And remarkably, I was a finalist. I didn't expect to be a finalist. I just put the package in because I was willing to serve, and I thought I met the minimum qualifications. And there really had the emphasis on minimum. And then I was fortunate enough to be a finalist and then to have a connection to Admiral Kelso. I wasn't superior to the other three candidates. In fact, one of them, Admiral Kelso, asked us a question. I thought this was a pretty clever interview question. You know, we got interviewed by 4 different admirals. Our wives were interviewed by 2 of those admirals. But the last 2 were the VCNO and the CNO. And the CNO's interview was at the end of his conversation he had with you. And Kelso was such an easy guy to talk to, so easygoing. And his last question, as my hand was on the doorknob, to each one of the 4 of us was the same question. If I don't select you, Hagan, and he always called us by our last name.
Yeah.
If I don't select you, Hagan, which one of the other 3 do you want me to select? And I told him the answer to it. I answered it, left the office, met up with my wife at the hotel that evening, and I said, I know who he's going to select, because I thought this person had the personality advantage over the rest of us.
Right.
There was a bosun mate, Chuck Baldwin, who went on to great things in his civilian life, and the other 2 candidates were great guys, Baker and Baker, Mike and Bruce and Mike Baker, the guy that I came to admire so much. But I said it's going to be Chuck Baldwin, and I was actually totally resigned to that. And I said, this was great. I got to come to D.C., ride on a CNO's barge. I'm going to know the Master Chief of the Navy. He's going to help me get my next to Command Master Chief tour. And so when Admiral Kelso selected me, I was pretty much blown away and surprised. But it would be a bad thing to point toward the MCPON because it would make you pervert your and structure your career in a way that's unnatural.
Yeah. Yep.
And so I advise people not to do that. I certainly didn't do that. And it was only in my Force Master Chief tour at St. Tetra when I realized that I was as qualified, although minimally. I met the minimum quals to do that job, and I was willing to serve. But your question about leadership advice, point your career in a direction that satisfies some personal drive, and it's always situational. The Cobbs, I mean, I admire the submarine community so much, and I used the submarine community as the role model for many things that I worked on, warfare quals, among them pride in their heritage. But my advice would be to study your heritage so that you understand what kind of a standard you have to live up to. The more you learn about the sailors that served before you under adverse circumstances, I'm a student of World War II, all the services, the history of World War II. I've done a massive amount of reading, and I find there's an endless trove of treasure out there to soak in. And if you don't do that, I think you're not completing your the full set of values that should be shaping your career. And the last thing, I don't put too much. Again, you may not like this, you may not understand it, but I don't put too much credence in leadership textbook. I've been to a number of forums where the Master Chief of the Navy has a different person coming in to hawk his book. They're all forgettable. They may have an interesting read, but I don't know that they help very much. On the other hand, reading about the leaders of the past, the memoirs of chiefs, the memoirs of enlisted people, the memoirs of the commanding officers and the giants, reading about them, I think is the greatest leadership lessons that I personally, as I judge it, they're the better leadership lessons, period.
Yeah, you get the insights of what they're thinking, how they thought through That's what I think people want, like how
And
they
how
thought through
discouraged they got, how close to failure they were, how close to giving up they were. And then they turned the corner.
Yep.
What kind of, you talk about adversity. Adversity is the kind of things that they went through on the USS Indianapolis, or I just read I tend to, when I read a book, I want other people to read it when I'm blown away by it. So I go and I just went and read the story of the submarine that had sunk the most ships in World War II, that got sunk off the Japanese coast. The crew was taken prisoner. The crew that survived was only a few people. O'Kane, it's a story of Richard O'Kane, the captain, who survived and was in. I read that story, and I was so blown away by it. I was so impressed by it. I bought all the copies that were cheap online of the used. I bought about 12 copies and mailed them to the Force Master Chiefs. I mailed 3 copies to the O'Kane, one for the CPO mess, one for the wardroom, and one to the cruise library.
Yeah. Awesome.
I just couldn't resist the impulse to do that. And I've done that with a number of other books that I've read, and you can get them online now. You don't have to pay $30 each for them now. If you look at Abe's books, you can get them for $5.99 and even less. So that's my philosophy about leadership is learn from those who have accomplished great things in the past, and don't get too hung up on some leadership style. Can I give you one more example of somebody you'll relate to? Because I meant to put this in earlier. When I talk to young chiefs, selectees, or the chief's mess, I want to make the point that your leadership style, which is kind of the question you were asking, don't feel like your leadership style has to change when you make chief or has to fit some mold. I've seen that happen. I've seen somebody that's kind of a meek, quiet individual all of a sudden try the authoritarian shouting, raising their voice. And the example that I use is 2 guys that you may know, both of them. I know you know one is Bob Conklin and Tony Calhoun.
Yep.
They were Force Master Chiefs for me when I was in MCPON, Surf Pack, and Surfland. As individuals, they could not have been more different. One was black, one was white. One was the only thing they had in common is they were both snipes. One was quiet, extremely thoughtful, very slow to speak. Bob Conklin was not any of those things. He was raucous. He had a PhD in sarcasm.
Yep.
But they were both tremendously effective Force Master Chiefs. When I look back, I didn't have any combination like that in any of the other warfares during my whole tour. And when I got to thinking about why was that? What did they have in common? You know what they had in common? They went out to the waterfront every day to the chief's mess. They left their office. What I would call Bob Conklin, his office would say he's on, and they'd name the ship. He was very seldom in his office. neither one of them traveled for the sake of per diem or to go to some exotic place or to have a good time. They didn't go to USO conferences in Germany or Japan, even though they could. Their boss would have probably signed their orders. They traveled where it was necessary for the job. I admired them both so much, and to this day I do. I talk to them regularly. In fact, I just sent Bob Conklin in the book. I just finished reading a book about destroyers that I knew he would enjoy, and Bob is going through some rough times right now. But that's the example that I give is don't change your style. The style that made you a good first class will make you a good chief. And those guys taught me that lesson. I knew you'd identify with that. And I'm
absolutely.
Proud that you're an admirer of Bob Conklin.
Yeah, he was my CMC on Ronald Reagan, the second one after Buck Heffernan.
Was he really?
Yep. So I definitely got a taste of that. And I write about him in the CPO guide,
well,
his philosophy on the Chiefs mess. So he's definitely, I haven't talked to him in a bit.
I'm so happy to hear that. I think Bob was a better leader in a Chiefs mess than maybe anybody that I ever met.
Yep.
A leader of the mess, which is the biggest challenge for the command master chief.
Yep.
But Bob, when he was the force, here's the other thing. Today's structure of force master chief, when you finish a force master chief tour, you have to go to another tour with an admiral.
Yeah.
Or get out, I guess.
Yep.
Bob Conklin, that attitude, there was some of that attitude when I was MCPON. Some people thought it was a step down to go to be a command master chief. Bob Conklin, when he left the surf plant job, I needed somebody to go to Baton, which was struggling.
Yep.
They had a problem with their command master chief was not succeeding, and it wasn't because he was not a good guy. I knew him. It was because the CO was smothering him.
Yeah.
I asked Bob Conklin to go to Baton, and he was successful immediately. And one of the things he did is make it clear to the CNO, I'm your command master chief, I'm not your whipping boy.
Yeah.
And, I don't know what words he used, but I know that he knew what had taken place. He served Baton. If I'm not mistaken, he went from there to Eisenhower. Did he?
Yep. Or Ronald Reagan.
To Reagan.
Yep.
Yeah, it was Jimmy Searles that went to Jimmy Searles was another one of my guys that went to carriers afterwards, America and Eisenhower. But I like to use examples from the past. Bob Conklin is one of the best examples. And when I said he had a PhD in sarcasm, his humor is always good natured.
Yep.
It's never to inflict pain on somebody, to humiliate or to embarrass them. It is the old style CPO mess.
Yeah.
With just the right touch of wisdom.
Yep.
And certainly
absolutely.
Humility. And Tony Calhoun, very different, but so effective and such a strong character. I had so many good experiences with those guys solving problems that they stuck in my memory. So that's I've
awesome.
Long past your scheduled time.
No. That's great. I think that's great advice and a great point to land on. Thanks again for this time. There's a lot in there. We could go on for 2 more hours. I might come back at you for another interview because there's other areas I want to get in, and there's great experiences that I think is important to capture. And I don't care if it's in a book or in a digital forum like this. There is learning to be had. There's advice that, again, is worthwhile for everyone. So, and thank you for the coin. I know we didn't get into this, but I appreciate your coin, the significance of it, and the thought that's put into it. But good luck to you, and thank you for the work you continue to do and engagement you do with our Navy now.
Well, I don't do much, but I admire your initiative and energy to keep it up there. So part of it is because you're 54. You're a young man. So, I appreciate the time, and maybe we can get together in person the next trip.
Absolutely.
In Norfolk, right?
Yep, absolutely.